My name is Pietro Sirena. At present, I serve as second vice president of the European Law Institute, and it is my great honor and pleasure to chair this webinar of today on the Consumer Agenda 2030 of the EU Commission as a webinar in which we will have also the opportunity, not only, of course, to discuss the action plan that has been presented by or announced by the Commission by publication of the Consumer Agenda 2030 last November, but also to discuss the response that has been handed in by the European Law Institute by participating in the public consultation that was launched by the Commission in the wake of the publication of the Consumer Agenda 2030. And we will hear directly first from the drafters of the ELIS response to the public consultation, namely Pascal Pichonat and Aneta Wieworowska-Domagalska. They are going to be the speakers of the first panel, and they are going to illustrate on the response that first and foremost they have drafted and elaborated on, of course, with the contribution of all the not only governing bodies, but also the membership of the European Law Institute. And we will have the opportunity as well to hear from the side of the EU Commission as well. Thanks to David Martin Ruiz, and also to involve in this debate somehow the representatives of the stakeholders, that is to say consumers on the one hand, and on the other the industry and the business representatives and actors. And in this respect, we will hear from Els Bruggeman, who is Group Manager, Policy, Enforcement and Communication at Euroconsumers, and from Ilya Bruggeman, who is Director for Digital Single Market and Consumer Policy at Eurocommerce. And the agenda of this webinar sets out also and I would say most importantly a Q&A session to conclude the discussion, to have the opportunity to open the floor and to collect questions, interventions, observations, which the speakers are going to address and to provide their reaction to. With that said, in the interest of time, I would, with no further ado, hand over to the first two speakers, whom I have announced already, Pascal Pichonat and Aneta Wieworowska-Domagalska. A few words of introduction, even though both of them do not need any introduction for sure. Not on my end, but first of all, Pascal Pichonat, as you all know, as the past president of our institute, Pascal has served as ILI president from 2021 to 2025. He is a professor of Swiss private law, Roman law, European consumer law, and comparative contract law at the University of Fribourg, as we can see from the backdrop behind him. He has served as well as Dean of the Law Faculty of his university, the University of Fribourg. also former president of the Swiss Federal Commission for Consumers and president of the European Law Faculties Association, ELFA. Aneta Wieworowska-Domagalska participated, among many other academic undertakings, in the work of the study group on a European Civil Code. Particularly, she co-authored the Principles of European Law on Sales. She has worked as a chief specialist for the Polish Ministry of Justice. And particularly, she has been involved in legislation in the area of private law and also in negotiating private law instruments in the European Council. She also chaired a council working group during the Polish presidency. She has been involved in the transposition of EU directives into Polish law. And between 2019 and 2021, she served as a co-president of the Consumer Law Forum, established by the Polish Commissioner for Human Rights. I failed maybe to mention first that is most importantly, in a sense, for us, because we have benefited from Aneta's engagement and commitment to the Institute, because she has served on the Council of the European Law Institute, as well as on the Executive Committee of the European Law Institute. With that said, I hand over to Pascal Pichonnat, and after him to Aneta Wieworowska-Domagalska for the illustration of the response of the European Law Institute to the public consultation on the Consumer Agenda 2030. Pascal, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Pietro. Thank you for this kind invitation. And indeed, with Aneta, we decided to share and have a kind of ping pong in the presentation of some of the features of this response by the ELI. And maybe I will share my screen so that you can also see the PowerPoint. The response by the ELI to this public consultation was approved by the ELI Council on the 28th of August 2025, meaning that since then, of course, a lot of things have evolved, and so in a way, it's a snapshot of a specific moment. But still, I think it's still valid, and we look forward to present some of the results of what is in fact a collective effort. Because as you mentioned, Pietro, Aneta and myself did draft the response, but then there were comments and suggestions by a number of members of the executive of the ELI Council and of course of our scientific director. Let me maybe just give you the structure of our response. So we identified a couple of current challenges, impact of consumer regulations, elements that we now see also discussed and treated by many omnibus initiatives. Then the implicit transfer of risk through the UCTD, Unfair Contract Terms Directive, and then nature and challenges of the evolving legal framework. And then we try to come up with some suggestions to have a more effective framework, and we'll discuss that today. But of course, the first challenge is the impact of consumer regulations, and more specifically, the role of the information model, which has been used by the European Union since the 70s. And this foundational idea is that the more informed the consumer is, the more transparent the market, and therefore the safer transactions will be, enabling therefore the growth of an internal market. Now, already in the 70s, in fact, to be precise, I think in 1973, the informational model had been criticized by some authors, among them William Whitford, who made some very interesting critiques that I just want to mention here. We also cited his work in the response. Basically, Whitford's view was that pre-contractual disclosure regulations had less impact on consumer behavior than post-contractual disclosure regulations, which made the latter more attractive, in fact, at least in his eyes. And in a way, in anticipation of the behavioral law and economic approach, Whitford asserted that post-contractual disclosure regulations were more likely to cause behavioral changes in consumers than were pre-contractual disclosures regulations. And this was explicable, according to him, among other arguments he cites, because it was easier to be sure that most consumers would be interested in information when it was given to them when they had a problem, basically, and not at the pre-contractual stage. He had also a very interesting analysis on the cost of this information, because he said the cost of information would be passed on the buyers, which, according to him, made sense when dealing with post-contractual information. In contrast, when you deal with pre-contractual information, the paradox is that if the aim is to impact consumer behaviors and potentially induce them not to conclude a given contract, the cost of that pre-contractual information would be borne by those who either did not care about the information and therefore concluded the contract, or had other incentives to conclude the contract despite the pre-contractual information. So in fact, the cost of the pre-contractual information is borne by those who do not care or do not read this pre-contractual information. And already in 1973, he said, maybe that's not the right incentive. Of course, that was before the behavioral economics and so on, but it is certainly not the place here to discuss in detail whether the role and aim of the information model in the EU legislation is still the best way to look forward, but at least we presented some limits of this information model. As you can see here, we have information which is insufficient if you have no negotiation power. So that's already the first problem, of course. You may get all the information you want. What matters at the end of the day is the negotiation power. Secondly, we know that information is often totally disregarded, or at least not well processed by consumers, and they have heuristics, they have all sorts of cognitive biases, which means that the information does not reach its aim, which is a rational decision-making process. And finally, we know also through behavioral economics and cognitive sciences that text is more difficult to process than images. And we have seen, and I'll come back on that, we have seen that pictures and pictograms might be more efficient, of course. And finally, nowadays, information as a nudge is something that is getting more and more visible. And to that extent, we see also that in the regulation of the EU, we have a lot of information, a cornucopia of information, but at the same time, it triggers some remedies. The right to withdraw, the right to terminate if you do not get or provide the information, but sometimes also just the right for courts to look into, for instance, a price of performance relationship when it is linked to unfair contract terms. Aneta will come back to that. So let me just, in a couple of words, give you the gist of the transformation of this informational model as we presented in the response. First, of course, the idea would be to reduce and streamline these information duties. We have really a cornucopia of information duties, which makes it very difficult not only for consumers to read and to understand all this information, but of course also for businesses to cope with all of them, a kind of compliance of information duties. And here we mentioned one example, Article 10, subparagraph 3 of the Credit Agreements for Consumers Directive, the so-called CCD2, where you have a kind of streamlining of information and a clear explanation also what to do if, for instance, it's impossible to present all the information. The second aspect is to revisit the timing, not only saying pre-contractual, post-contractual information, but maybe also just to hand over the information when it is really needed, and not everything at the beginning. Then changing the visual aspect with pictograms potentially, and the ECO directive did that to some extent. And finally, we also said that it would be very important to have clear consequences in case of violation of the duties of information, which is not always the case. So here, certainly, there's also things that could be improved. And finally, as a kind of last aspect, we mentioned the 3-level information model, which would run as follows. Some fundamental information should be provided for the conclusion of the contract, but the focus should be on the risk of concluding the contract and the shift of specific risks on the consumer. But all the rest could be kept for further information when the contract is running, including in times of contract modification, for instance, also the right to terminate, for in some situations, the right to withdraw. And finally, more granular information should only be given at the moment of efficient enforcement. Basically, you missed your plane and then you want to know what to do. Well, it's very nice to have all the information at the pre-contractual stage, but you don't really care about it. And so what you would need is to get a straightforward, probably digitized information at that stage, which happens sometimes on a free basis. Now, that's the first aspect of the presentation. And we will now get to a second proposal, and I hand over to you, Aneta.
Thank you very much, Pascal. And before I jump into the presentation itself, I would like to say one reservation, apology. So, reservation occurred for the Ministry of Justice, where I am representative of the Ministry of Justice for Consumer Protection. Of course, my presentation here today is us being the LI member and not working for the Ministry of Justice. And second, please forgive me my voice. I've been absent for any LI activities for 6 months due to injury. And first time I can take part, which makes me very happy.
Aneta, sorry for interrupting you, but we can hear you not very well from time to time. If you can
well, on my side,
maybe it could have to do something with your hands and gesture. I'm not sure.
Okay, okay. I'm hiding my hands. I'm not moving them anymore. I'm getting closer to my computer. So as you can see in my pictures, you can distinguish my slides from slide. There will be stick pictures that represent what I'm speaking about. So what we mention in our report is that informational duties transfer risks of Unfair Contract Terms Directive. And of course, we have the increasing level of consumer information duties that the traders must fulfill comes from two sources. First, it's increasing level of rules and increasing level of demands that the directives, normally full harmonization directives, set for the business. And those are, in practice, easier to fulfill by the traders. The second source of these obligations is the case law of the Court of Justice. And here there is no much predictability that traders can set for their contracts, which means that preparing a contract that will fulfill the level of informational duties becomes more and more challenging. And what has fueled this process of increasing informational expectations introduced by the Court of Justice is the increased use of the Article 4, Paragraph 2 exception of the Unfair Contract Terms Directive. This article allows exception from unfairness control once the main contract term that refers to the main subject matter of the contract is transparent. And then we had, because consumers would like to also find abusive terms that refer to the main contract terms of the main contract terms, they started to demand more and more information to be provided to them in court cases. And so the level of expected information to be provided rose and rose. And what happened was that the Court of Justice equaled information duties under Article 4.2, which mentions them for the exception application, Article 5 that sets general information duties, and Article 3.1 that talks about unfairness control, but doesn't refer directly to information provided to the consumer. That was introduced by the Court of Justice. So generally speaking, the consumer is to understand the economic consequences of the term being included in the contract. But what that means, what that means in practice, that is sometimes very difficult to decipher. And we had, from Kassler case, we had increasing amount of information to be provided. The first case that started to limit those amounts of information was perhaps the Spanish case C-125/18, this Gomez case, where the Court of Justice referred to information being published and available. So the trader does not have to provide extra information if it's already available. And another quite groundbreaking case on not only when it comes to the informational duties, but also when it comes to the relation between Unfair Contract Terms Directive and other European instruments was decided on 12th of February this year. And it was Polish case, PKO BP, which discussed the information duties with regards to WIBOR index used for credit contracts. And in this case, it was the mechanism that I have described, used by the consumer side. So more and more information to be provided to consumer to allow him or her to understand the economic consequences of the concluded contracts. Also informations that clearly are impossible to understand to average consumer. Average consumer rather has problems with understanding the content of the contract, and the BMR regulation, which dictates how these financial indexes are to be constructed, is very, very difficult. They're difficult to understand sometimes even for specialists, for lawyers. And the Court of Justice said, no, this is enough. Well, if there is no need to provide extra information compared to what consumer is allowed on the basis of consumer credit directive, or consumer directives, or regulation that deals with indexes. And the picture is a hydra that represents the many phases of informational duties.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We are not
Pascal,
over,
yes,
Pietro.
Sure.
It's still
me.
It's still me.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
So the question is, what comes to mind? This is a very, very old question. Do we go for public enforcement or private enforcement of consumer rights in case of the violation? And of course, both, I cannot move my hands, sorry, forgot. And both has the pros and cons, and both have the advocates. But the question arises somehow those days, what is the adequate enforcement model for the modern market? The market has changed tremendously since the first consumer directives were introduced, and since first enforcement instruments were introduced at the European level. And one could question whether the private enforcement even has a place, especially in the context on online contracts or digital economy or platform economy, because a single consumer against the huge enterprises stands no chance. So maybe the public enforcement is the answer to the market that we have. That, of course, eliminates completely autonomy of will and the ability of private person to pursue his or her own rights the way the person deems proper. And, you know, while I have said that maybe private enforcement has no place, Poland, from which I come from, tells a completely different story. And the source of this example is the Swiss franc cases that, or rather Swiss franc credit, consumer credits that were more than 700,000 concluded in Poland. They all contain unfair contract terms. It was a systemic violation, and we had no public enforcement of those violations. We had no public action that would address systematically those violations. So what happened, because those contracts were quite expensive and there was a lot of value in invalidating those contracts, there was a massive movement of private individuals, consumers, to courts. So by now, by the end of the 25, we have over 500,000 cases that were introduced to courts of first and second instance. The numbers that you see, the over 400,000, is the first instance court cases initiated, and the 142 is the second instance cases. We had 175,000 settlements. As you can see, settlements began much later than the court cases. But what is the end result? The end result is, first of all, that our courts, civil courts, deal mostly with Swiss franc cases. Statistically, in the second instance court, civil judge has, of all cases that the civil judge deals with, 75% are Swiss franc cases, and this number will increase. At the first instance level, it's 40%. And private enforcement became a business, a well-functioning business with all its pros and cons, including consumer rights violations. So we have a situation when somehow, or maybe that could be a better picture, like the snake eats its own tail. Here we have a picture of a Polish eagle that is really, really tired because this situation drags on for years. And there is, well, it's going to end within maximum 2 years. But please remember this picture because there will be, I will refer to it in my next slide.
If we come to the next slide, and based on of also this situation, one of the tools that we should or we could envisage to implement is an ex-ante tool, meaning that before using, for instance, standard terms, you have, like it is the case, by the way, in Italy, you have either an administrative office or a certain entity that would look at standard terms and give a kind of pre-use analysis of this situation, whether it's abusive or not, trying to avoid that all the ex post after use analysis comes and blocks all the tribunals. And that's why we propose this as one of the measures in the report. We also mentioned that it would be important to have a pre-litigation stage and best practices in the hands of public entities. So not just a mediation, but even in a pre-mediation stage where, thanks to technological elements, thanks to AI, and following the trend of dejudicialization, the issues would be dealt with in a more specific way and try to avoid the difficulties. And finally, and that's where Aneta comes in again, we will try to come up with a number of AI and technology-driven solutions. And I hand over to you, Aneta, for the final word.
Just a few sentences. So the question is, how do we want to make the enforcement more effective? And do we speak about a general level or a particular level of consumer protection? So do we want to introduce something consumer specific or simply increase effectiveness of public or judicial enforcement, which can lead us to using different tools? And of course, either precise rules like information duties in the Consumer Credit Directive, or repetitive cases like a situation with Polish Swiss franc cases or Spanish level floor clauses cases, are very fit for using an algorithm or maybe even AI. And if you look at this picture, you see that it looks kind of strange. The Polish eagle looks kind of strange. And what I prompted to Gemini was that I wanted the eagle to cover its eyes with the entire wing. And this is what the AI produced. And I thought it's a perfect example how careful we should be, because if we use a simple algorithm, it's not creating anything. We have certainty as long as our database is correct. But once we get into generative areas, we run into problems. Just to give a few examples of increasing effective enforcement through AI or algorithm. Unfair contract terms detection. And here I would be a little bit hesitant, even though such tool is already used by Polish Consumer and Competition Protection Office, because unfairness requires balancing, it requires mitigating, which might be difficult for 0-1 structure of algorithm. But it goes very nicely with informational duties violations, especially if those are precise. So it's either fulfilled or not. And examples that we already see is the automatic compensation calculation projects in Germany, but this is very fit for technological advancements. Swiss franc cases, something that we are doing in Poland using an algorithm to speed up the procedure, and settlement of performances in general, because it's also not generative AI, it's simply calculation. So there are many, many areas where technology can help us to increase the effectiveness of enforcement. And that would be the end of our presentation. So thank you very much. And we pass back to Pietro.
Yeah, thank you, Aneta. Thank you, Pascal, for your insightful presentation and all the brilliant and inspirational ideas and proposals you have provided to us. I'm sure we are going to discuss them later on, but in the interest of time, I have to refrain from comments because we are a bit behind the schedule, and therefore it's now my pleasure to hand over to the next speaker, namely David Martin Ruiz, who's going to share with us an update from the Commission on the Consumer Agenda, and we are most grateful to him for this, of course, some reflections on the response submitted by the European Law Institute to the public consultation. In the meanwhile, let me just invite the other attendees to pop their comments or questions by making use of their Q&A function. We are going to collect them, and then we will have the Q&A session at the end of this webinar, where the speakers would be talking on their behalf, but I'm sure they would be more than happy to react to the questions and to the comments from the other attendees of this meeting. Let me say a few words of introduction of the next speaker. I have announced already, David Martin Ruiz is a policy officer at the European Commission's Directorate General for Justice and Consumers, which he joined in May 2023. And before, David Martin Ruiz worked on digital consumer rights of the European Consumer Organization. Please, the floor is yours, Mr. Martin Ruiz.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. So first, I'm gonna zoom out a little bit. I wanted to give you a brief overview of the 2030 Consumer Agenda, and then just a few comments on the response submitted by the European Law Institute to the public consultation. And thanks again for that. That was a very interesting input. So first of all, on the consumer agenda, so as you rightly mentioned at the beginning, the 2030 Consumer Agenda was adopted on the 19th of November last year, and it sets out the strategic framework for EU consumer policy for the next 5 years. The agenda is based on two key considerations. The first one is that consumer protection, competitiveness, and sustainable prosperity are mutually reinforcing goals. So the 450 million consumers we have in the single market drive competition, they drive innovation, investment, and sustainable growth. And in turn, a competitive market increases the well-being of consumers by offering them a wide selection of quality products and services at affordable prices. The second consideration is the importance of the social, protective, and stabilizing dimension of consumer policy, which is particularly important in uncertain times or times of instability. Consumer policy serves to protect people's rights and ensure fair practices in the marketplace, and as such, it fosters fairness and it strengthens trust in our democracy. So with these considerations as a guide, the agenda identifies 4 key priority areas, each with different actions. And all this with the aim of responding to current challenges, whether related to e-commerce and the import of dangerous goods, or, for example, also the growing impact of climate change, or the need for strengthened protection for consumers online. The first priority area is an action plan for consumers in the single market. The aim of this action plan is to remove barriers that prevent consumers from fully enjoying all the benefits that the single market can offer them, and in turn also increase opportunities for businesses. This plan includes, for example, initiatives such as the evaluation of the regulation on geo-blocking, also measures to address unjustified territorial supply constraints, or a proposal for a regulation on single digital ticketing and booking for notably for rail travel. And the second priority is the protection of consumers online and digital fairness. So as e-commerce continues to grow, we have new technologies that develop, the use of AI becomes more widespread. We have to ensure that our framework provides consumers with strong protection and that it safeguards consumer autonomy and freedom of choice. And also the protection of minors online has become a priority concern. So in this area, one of the actions foreseen is the proposal for a Digital Fairness Act, which is scheduled for adoption later in the autumn this year. But there are many other issues addressed. We also would like to improve consumer protection against online fraud, and also more in relation to the discussion today, we aim to explore how digital tools such as digital labeling or the digital product passport can improve access to information about products and services for consumers, and also simplify obligations for businesses. The third priority is to promote sustainable consumption, which remains a key issue from our perspective. In this area, the first thing, of course, is to ensure the effective implementation and enforcement of recently adopted legislation, such as the Directive on Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition or the Directive on the Right to Repair. But looking ahead, we also want to continue working on the promotion of the circular economy, including sustainability features in e-commerce and the promotion of circular business models, such as those based on the return of products that are no longer used, or subscription-based models, or second-hand markets. The fourth priority is to strengthen the effective enforcement of consumer protection rules. And in this context, we address, for example, the issue related to e-commerce and the import of products from outside of the EU, which is a fundamental problem for consumers who are constantly exposed to unfair commercial practices and products that do not comply with European rules, but also it's a big problem for businesses which are exposed to unfair competition from those actors from outside of the EU which are not respecting our legislation. There's plenty of action that's been taken already in this area following the communication which was adopted in February last year, but much more needs to be done. And in this regard, one key action in our agenda is the revision of the Consumer Protection Regulation framework, which is also scheduled for the autumn this year. And in the context of enforcement, I'll mention later, but the issue of the use of AI tools for enforcement is also something on which we're working on and which is mentioned in the agenda. In terms of the priorities, I would like to mention two more overarching priorities, let's say, which which are the protection of vulnerable consumers and the simplification and reduction of administrative burden, which are cross-cutting priorities integrated throughout different elements across the agenda. For example, when we talk about the Digital Fairness Act, the DFA, this has an aspect of the protection of vulnerable consumers in relation to children, but also it has a simplification element, as I wanted to mention later on as well. There we are studying the possibility of simplifying certain information obligations, actually in the context of the DFA. In terms of where are we now with the agenda, it was adopted, as I said, in November last year. So right now we are already in full implementation mode, let's say. developing all the different initiatives and carrying out the actions mentioned throughout the agenda. There's been public consultation, for example, the Digital Fairness Act as well. We're carrying out the impact assessment. So there are many actions which are planned for 2026, not only the Digital Fairness Act and the CBC review, but we also have the European Product Act. We have the evaluation on geoblogging also for this year, territorial supply constraints initiatives also for this year. So there are many things on which we are working on. And I should underline that this is a, let's say, cross-cutting effort. One of the novelties of the agenda is its cross-cutting approach. So it's not a DigiJustice consumer protection in the traditional way strategy. It covers many different policy areas. So we have our colleagues in GROW working on the European Product Act. There's also colleagues in Connect working on DSA enforcement issues. There are consumer protection angles in many different initiatives. So just conscious of time, just a few short remarks on the contribution from the European Law Institute. Indeed, the issue of information to consumers is a key one, and it's also a point that is always highlighted by consumer organizations in their contributions and by businesses as well. We need to ensure that there's no information overload and that consumers receive the information at the right moment, and so that it is useful for them and they really empowers them as it should. When we're looking purely at the European let's say at the consumer acquis, so CRD, UCDD, UCPD mostly. Those are the basic principles and obligations, and about how information needs to be provided, it needs to be transparent, etc. Don't need to explain all that. Also has some more, let's say, specific obligations in terms of certain things that need to be communicated. But the feeling also is that with this type of rules like the CPD, UCDD, that also gives room for maneuver in terms of how the information is provided. And it also gives room to move towards, let's say, better ways of providing information. This paradigm shift that is mentioned in the ELI response, we don't think that it's, let's say, it doesn't go against the existing rules. It can something that can be developed under the existing rules as well. And in fact, on the guidance that the Commission adopted on the Consumer Rights Directive, for example, we underline that information is to be provided when it's more relevant during the process. Also underlines that there could be information that it should be layered in certain cases. So we think that there's room for innovation, let's say, in this regard, and we don't want to be overly prescriptive either, because we want to give the market the possibility to develop best practices as well in this regard. It's true that then when we look beyond the consumer acquis, and I'm sure Ilya will mention this, if we look at all the different pieces of legislation, that is true that we come up with a lot of different obligations which can be very specific, for example, in terms of what has to be written on a label and this type of things. And here there's, of course, as I mentioned, we're looking into digital labeling. For example, what can be done with the digital product passport as well. But we have to keep in mind that certain things will have to stay on a physical form, or at least you need to have the possibility to ask for them in a physical form. This is important from the point of view of accessibility of the information as well. So all these things need to be taken into account. I also wanted to mention that on the side of regulation, of course, there's also different approaches that are being adopted in the response and before in the response to the consultation and in the initial presentation. You mentioned the CRD and the streamlining of information. I can also mention, for example, in terms of the telecoms regulation, where you have this provision that you have to provide a contract summary to the consumer with the key issues which are in the contract to try to make it easier for them to understand as well. So pictograms of visualization as well is an area where we are doing different things. For example, in the context of the implementation of the directive for empowering consumers in the green transition, we're working on this new label about the legal guarantee rights and the durability guarantee. So, but again, with labels have to be careful because you need harmonized labels. You have to make sure that not too many labels. So there are all these different things that need to be considered. So also simplification measures. I mentioned under the DFA, we are looking in particular at in-app purchases, and when you have repetitive transactions with the same trader, that there are certain pre-contractual disclosures where you would not need, the trader would not need to repeat them again and again under this type of transactions and other, among other issues. And lastly, on the use of AI for enforcement, I think that this is also, this is also another very important point for us, and we know it's an important point for the enforcement authorities who also often lack resources to carry out their work. So we at the Commission, in terms of these tools, we have the eLab and we have the eSurveillance web crawler, which is for identifying unsafe products online. And we are working with the national enforcement authorities to use these tools. We're also developing a web crawler for passenger rights. So there's definitely a lot that's going on here. And also in terms of this goes beyond consumers, but we have this work stream on the digitization of justice, which also includes the use of AI tools to support the judicial authorities. So I would just finish with one word of caution as well, to echo also some of the points mentioned by the previous speaker. AI will be helpful for sure, but at least at this point, we cannot fully rely on AI for many things. I would say you would always need some sort of human oversight. And also when you're talking about assessing, for example, contractual clauses, it's not straightforward that you're just simply going to put the contractual clause through an AI assistant is going to tell you this is unfair, this is illegal, because there are many other things that need to be taken into account when you assess that unfairness. So at the moment, AI, yes, helpful, but not the magic God solution, let's say, and it will surely develop further as time passes. So I'm just going to stop there. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
No, it's also your gratitude for this comprehensive and detailed picture of the action plan of the Commission, of the many actions that have been undertaken or are on the verge of being undertaken by the Commission for pursuing and enhancing consumer protection. And I believe it's really a very interesting and, if I may say so, inspiring agenda. And for our parts, as an Institute of European Law, of course, we are keen on contributing to its development. With that said, we have now the opportunity to hear the voice of the stakeholders that sit at the end of this market relations. That is to say, on the one hand, of course, consumers who are somehow going to be represented by the next speaker, namely Els Bruggeman, and on the other and the industry or the professional suppliers of goods and services, and their voice is going to be represented by Ilya Bruggeman. And finally, as I have announced, we will have maybe not 20 minutes, a bit less, but in any case, we will have some time spared for comments and questions from the audience. It's my pleasure to introduce Els Bruggeman. She is Group Manager, Policy Enforcement and Communication at Euroconsumers, which all of us are acquainted with. It's the global consumer group gathering many national consumer entities, at least 6 of them, or maybe even more, but together they represent over 6 million consumers. And Els Bruggeman is responsible for policy and advocated related issues, and external communication. I also introduced the next speaker, and I'm not going to intervene in between the two of them. Ilya Brueggemann is Director for Digital Single Market and Consumer Policy at Eurocommerce, which he joined in 2013, and he leads the organization's activities across a broad range of policy issues, including digital transformation, single market, payments, and consumer protection. With that said, I hand over to S. Brueggemann. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for offering the opportunity to Euroconsumers to bring in the consumer perspective. We can say many things on the consumer agenda, but if it's okay with you, I will just focus some of my comments on actually the ELI report, and congratulations on that. It's a very thorough and good report, and you for sure picked the right and a very timely and relevant angle, the information model. But before going maybe to the suggestions putting forward in your response, maybe I can share some minor reflections on the analysis, because actually I am not that pessimistic, or at least I refuse, and that's maybe our rebellious side, we refuse to believe that consumers are weak in this model or would not be able to exude their power. Yes, the information model absolutely is not perfect, and no, it is not the panacea. There are many other things that we need to do, but still it is, at least for us as Euroconsumers, a key cornerstone, not merely of consumer empowerment, but also even more for a strong European economy. Now more than ever, it is for us a key pillar to drive this European competitiveness that we are all pursuing. David already mentioned it. Europe has a unique industrial asset, and it's the 415 million consumers. And unlocking the power of these consumers is not merely nice to have or good for consumers. There's a bigger picture here. It is key for innovation-driven businesses, and it is crucial for Europe nowadays. So what a competitive Europe nowadays needs more than ever is really strong, empowered consumers that are able to take upon this challenge, pick up the gloves and be these agents of change, consumers that are able to challenge markets to do better, and finally deliver this, the innovation that actually meets the people's need. And for that, having the right information is key. If consumers do not have the right information, or they have barriers to act upon, well, then we will end up with underperforming businesses that deliver bad quality at bad prices to the detriment of the good ones. And I can imagine, if you're an innovative business, that you would like to know that at the end of the day, you have people, consumers buying your products. Well, it will only be possible if you have well-informed, well-protected consumers that are able to make the good decisions without being ripped off. So probably you won't find it a coincidence that we made it our mission at Euroconsumers to empower people and improve the market. And probably it's not a coincidence that all of our national organizations started as testing organizations, and it's still very much the core activity. It lays at the basis of many comprehensive comparison tools that we offer to consumers, from what kind of washing machine do you need to buy to what AI subscription model is the best for you. At the same time, we are absolutely not naive. We're very realistic, and we absolutely acknowledge that what worked 60 years ago for a consumer organization, but also in terms of information, it doesn't necessarily work today. And it's absolutely true. And here we fully agree with the analysis made by Eli, that information and the context in which it's provided has become more complex and more challenging, and we need to evolve with it. We need to evolve in the information model, and we need to evolve also as a consumer organization. So do we need to make it better? Absolutely. And we very much appreciate the different suggestions that have been put forward in the response to the consultation on the consumer agenda. They're very pragmatic and hands-on, and we see many opportunities in that. Because indeed, it is very challenging nowadays as a consumer to navigate all this information overload that, let's be honest, is often also used by businesses to have their back covered or even to hide things. At least it is not always presented in a way that is really empowering to consumers. But I absolutely do not want to point fingers, because I also think we, as consumer organization, we need to have a good look in the mirror, because every effort that has already been made together with industry to streamline information or to make it more rational or reduce it, and there have been attempts in the past, believe me, I've been there. It is actually often consumer organizations who are sometimes a little bit more reluctant and have the tendency to add more and more information just to make sure that consumers are not misled. So it's also up to us to be courageous and take this leap. And we, as Euroconsumers, we stand ready to do this. A very good example, and David already mentioned, it's also mentioned in the consumer agenda, is the digital product passport. I mean, in our vision, this can be really a game changer. It holds so much information. It can be a very empowering tool for consumers, but even more, it is a very good tool to finally, achieve this European single market. So have a more unified information flow that we absolutely need also to, speed up the European single market. But it holds a mass of information. It's not just for consumers, it's also for professionals. So there's tons of information in there. The big challenge is, how will we translate this mass of information to something really usable for the consumers? You cannot expect everyone to scan a QR code and read an encyclopedia to make a buying decision just in the shop. Some information needs to be very easily accessible so you can make an on-the-spot buying decision. And that's, for me, the big challenge of the digital product passport. And that's exactly that exercise that we as Euroconsumers are doing within the Circular Intelligence Association, together with all kinds of other stakeholders. And for us, this is key. The important thing, whatever we do to update this information model, and we very much like the proposals that are have been put forward here, it needs to work for consumers. And for that, you need to work with consumer organizations. And as Euroconsumers, we do stand ready to do that. However, I would like to, add another opportunity that maybe has not been fully developed in the response. And again, I'm a bit more of the glass, the girl half glass full instead of empty, a bit more optimistic. And I would like to point out the opportunities indeed offered by AI. I know that, it has been developed for enforcement, but I think we can do more with AI. We fully need to grasp the opportunities that are offered by this technological evolution to fully empower consumers and ease up the hunt for the right information. Just to give you an example, I mentioned that we all of Euroconsumers organizations were founded as testing organizations. And ever since the oldest one, it's the Belgian one, Testachat, was created in 1957, we have gathered a wealth of science-based information, and they're all carefully piled in comparison tools and complex web structures. Even I know this information is on there, and I know that we did the test. Even I find it difficult sometimes to find the right information because it's so much, and that's just the information of a consumer organization. So what we did is that we recently developed an AI tool, you could even call it a bot, that make my life and that of many consumers a little bit easier. He's called Ollie. The kid needed to have a name. But instead of navigating the whole web page and clicking through different categories, I now can just ask Ollie, look, what is the best, what telco subscription fits my profile the best, or what is the most energy-friendly dishwasher for me? And then I would get the answer, plus I get redirected to the right resources so I can check and delve into this information. But it speeds up things, and it is another way to have access to relevant information that empowers consumers to make certain decisions. It makes it easier. Of course, this is just a tiny example of what a difference AI can make, and there's more than just buying decisions that consumers need to make. But we need to grasp it, not merely for enforcement, but where we fully support, and we fully support all the suggestions made by the ILA report on enforcement, but we need to grasp it also beyond this. But again, here, and I will wrap up here, again, here, whatever we do around AI tools, it needs to be consumer proof. And here I agree with David, we need to have a careful look that it is really delivering the right information and that it is trustworthy. And also there, we can be a partner, we can test it, and we can evaluate the tools to make sure that they're really consumer proof. And I will wrap up here and then leave it from one Bruggeman to the other. So thank you.
All right, I'll take over. So I'm just going to share a few slides. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll try to be quick about it. But I think it will help you. All right. So first, who are we? So because I can imagine maybe not everybody knows Eurocommerce. So we're the European Association for Retail and Wholesale, and we represent food, non-food, brick and mortar stores, online, omni-channel. So we have a very broad membership. And here you see on the right side, actually, you see all the countries where we have national associations as a member. And on the left side, you see companies and also affiliated members who represent a part of our membership. Here there are some facts and figures. So actually, we are the largest private employer in Europe. We represent 5 million businesses, and most of them are SMEs. So actually, that's quite, it's quite something. But now, I kept actually a slide which I showed, I think, before on another conference organized by the European Law Institute about the consumer agenda. And I just wanted to, I just kept it because we had 6 things that we thought were very important. Obviously, it's consumer trust, right? And this is very important because this is why consumers buy online. This is why consumers buy cross-border, but this is also why consumers buy from traders they don't know yet, right? So if you don't have that trust, I think it will really undermine, the retail sector, but also I think the EU economy. Another big issue for us is the unfair competition from outside the EU. So our sector is really suffering. And you may have heard that in 2024, there were 4.6 billion packages entering the EU. And, last year it were almost 6 billion packages. So you see, despite everything what has happened, the problem has gotten worse. And a part of that obviously is also that, everybody complies with the rules for consumer protection, which is also, I think, part of the discussion today. We are a strong supporter of the review of the CPC regulation. We did also a joint statement with Business Europe and with Beuk, and we see, that before we look at new rules, we have to enforce the rules that we have better. And there's this issue about single market barriers. Well, you have many also in consumer law, because part of our work that we do is actually we deal with infringements by member states, and there are often a lot of national requirements being introduced for products, for labeling, for composition or whatever. It can be really anything which undermines the internal market. And the point why I left it in was because we also said at the time, we think consumer information requirements. So I think it's a very timely discussion that we're having based on your paper, but also give new technologies a chance. So just what did we say actually on this rethink of consumer information? I think we acknowledge fully what was also in the paper, that we see that there are more and more information requirements introduced. But it's I think it's broader than only about terms and conditions, but it's also about what kind of information do you need to put on the product, where should it be on the product, and I think we see that for consumers, they usually, when you buy something, you look at three things, and the most important element is probably the price. So all this other information is probably lost. But it's the same thing for retailers, right? Because you need to provide all this information, and you need to be compliant, and the rules change all the time. So, especially for SMEs, how do you make sure that you actually are compliant? And I think in most cases, I would say this goes well, but I'm sure there are cases where it doesn't go well. And obviously there you have also the part, but I think this is another issue about rogue traders, we call them. So really the ones, that know that what they're doing is not okay, but they do it anyways, regardless of the rules. In our view, it's important to make a distinction if we look at labeling between what's essential and what is nice to know. Essential information is information you need to, I would say safely use or consume the product. And that needs to be on the product because you need to have that. So that also needs to be available in a physical format. But there's a lot of nice to know that you can provide in another way, in a digital format, or maybe via the future DPP. But maybe just to say a few things on this as well. So despite digital, I think we will always have digital and paper-based information. But there's also a risk that there's a shift from the burden on providing information to the retailer. So if you have to provide certain information that actually only the producer has, and you have to provide that in the store or somewhere else, okay, yeah, but then somebody needs to give that to you, and you need to pass it on. And I see sometimes also in recent legislation that this is not fully understood. And I think an example there is about the commercial guarantee under the Empowering Consumers Directive. Then it's important that all these digital tools, that can be very helpful, but they need to be interoperable, and also, they need to be proportionate in the way they are used, and they should, in our view, not disrupt commercial practices or fair competition. We should also refrain from being too prescriptive, because the more prescriptive you are, I think the more chances things are going wrong. And in most cases, it's also very contextual how you provide information to the consumer, and your customer. So you probably, know based on, what kind of category of customers that you are aiming at. And also if you are in a physical online environment, do you use your mobile phone, or is it just via the computer? So all these things have an impact on how to best to provide the information. And actually we asked also, to map existing consumer requirements in EU law and to simplify those. And I think it just boils down to, I think, three elements. You need to make the information for consumers understandable, you need to make it meaningful, and you need to make it manageable. And I think if it doesn't match these three conditions, I think we have a problem. Then zooming in on the contribution of Ally. So first of all, this is not necessarily all an official position, right? So I looked at your contribution and I just tried to make some kind of an assessment. So I would say this is some kind of an exchange of thoughts based on my experience. But you may not find this on our website, and maybe not every member would agree with exactly what I'm saying. But I really appreciate this contribution. I think it's great ideas, and I always enjoy, by the way, I think the Ally contributions that I've read so far. And obviously simplification, this is something we appreciate as businesses. But like I said at the start, for us, the issue about information requirements is a bit broader. Then there is the issue of the use of pictograms. So I just took some things out of this, right? I don't address everything because I don't think we have the time. I say yes, good idea, but we need to be mindful that we cannot reduce all information to a simple pictogram, right? I think we still need, as trader, we have obligations to make sure that the information is complete and accurate. So there's always this strive, we need to summarize, need to make it simple. Yes, but we also have other obligations and we don't want to get into trouble. And we also need to be mindful because actually, I think, David, you said it earlier, something about the harmonized notice for the legal guarantee and the harmonized label for the commercial guarantee on the empowering consumers. Yes, that was supposed to make it simple, but I think the way it developed is everybody wanted more and more and more. It has to be on the label. And now I think you need to have some kind of A4 format in your store, so did this make it easier for traders? I don't think so. Will consumers read all this information? I don't know. So it's also like, okay, if we go for a more simple solution, I think we need to make sure that we also stick to the logic behind it and not make it overly complex. Then the point, okay, providing the information when it is required or in a more granular way, I think that's fine, but we also need to make sure that we're not going to impose unclear burdens on the trader. For instance, okay, the trader then has to assess when it is time to provide that information, right? So, okay, when is it that time? And for some situations, it might be very obvious, but for other situations, less. So I think we need to be mindful that that we are not creating new unclear burdens, which actually will lead to new non-compliance. And I think that's not what we want. We want the consumer to be well informed. Then about ex-ante tools and best practices. Yeah, I mean, I think that's always a good idea to develop such tools. I think we always are a bit saying this should be on a voluntary basis, usually, because there might be businesses that already have a very good, approach. So we should not introduce things that become mandatory in a way, but I think it should help businesses to be compliant. And I think, and it was also, I think, already in the contribution, developing model contracts or model contractual clauses, I think, are always helpful to make it easier for businesses. I think we already talked a bit about the use of modern technologies or AI tools. So I would definitely say yes if you use them as a shopping assistant, else. But I think we need to be careful if we use it in another more formal way, because these tools, they need to be reliable and they need to be accurate. And I'm not sure if we are already there yet. So I think this is the future, right? This is where we're going. So we're going to use that. We're going to apply all these technologies, but I think in the meantime we need to make sure that that we're not getting ourselves into trouble at a later stage. All right. So then I think this is, by the way, my last slide, and then I'll stop. So some other points I would like to share with you. Obviously, is that what I said earlier. Okay, also at the retail side, we're overwhelmed by all these new information requirements, and every time they're coming more and more and more. So every new piece of legislation that you see at EU law that applies in one way or the other to retail or to products that we are selling, there's something new in there. And at the same time, if you look, for instance, at the product, the physical product, the space is very limited, especially for small products. So how much information can you provide? How much attention, how much interest has the consumer in all that information? So I think we need to be mindful that more information is not a solution to everything. It's not going to solve all our problems. I think we, going back to what I said earlier, you need to make it meaningful, understandable, and manageable. Still, at the same time, I think the basis is trust. I think the majority of our members, they are not there to mislead consumers or to impose unfair contract terms. They just want to make a living. They want to do business. They enjoy what they do. So in this sense, I think we need to have a risk-based approach when we look at the problems. And I think the biggest problem, I would say, is with the rogue traders, and they don't care about new rules. So if you create new rules, it will be the ones that are trying to be compliant that will incur, the costs, because they will make the effort. but the bad guys, they will just continue doing what they're doing, and actually their products and services might become more attractive because they don't, you know, they don't have all these costs. Another element is we have to stop mixing consumer law and product law, and we're doing that. So if you look at the Empower Consumers Directive, for instance, I think we now have a big issue where there are new labeling rules applying to products, but there are no provisions for products that are already lawfully placed on the market before the application date, which is creating a huge mess in our sector. But it's also about, okay, at a certain moment, you know, the trader in consumer law is actually can be a retailer, for instance, but it can also be a producer acting as a retailer. But if you are a producer acting as a retailer, you have much more information than if you are just a retailer. And we see sometimes if you mix consumer law and product law, these things get mixed up. We cannot provide information if certain information if the producer hasn't provided it to us. So, and I think we also had an issue on right to repair. Well, I think I'm running out of time. So, but I think it's important to not introduce product characteristics in consumer law, because consumer law and product law are organized completely differently. So, and it's creating legal uncertainty for our members. The last point is on the digital product passport. It has already been mentioned. I don't think it's a silver bullet, but I think Els already recognized that. But I do think it's an opportunity which can help to provide more information to consumers, you know, but this is all on a development. So I think we should definitely take that one into account. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I extend my gratitude and the other attendees' gratitude to the last two speakers for their very nice, I have to say, and interesting contributions to our debate. My takeaway are, on the one hand, that consumers eventually are not that weak and passive spectators as sometimes they're supposed to be, but they can really play the roles of co-regulators of the market once they are provided effectively with the information that they need to exercise this power of choice that they are endowed with. On the other hand, the need that we have to make a distinction between retailers and manufacturers when it comes to information rules and other requirements or issues of compliance with market regulations. And also I found interesting the caveat on the use of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. And of course, also the point on rogue traders was very interesting. I see we do not have much time left, but I see several comments. I hope that we are going at least to pick up some of them. First, to David Martin Ruiz about simplification as an overarching priority of the agenda and the consequences that we can expect of this goal pursuit of this achievement in terms of the impact that this is going to have on consumer law. I see a further comment to Ilya Bruggemann. Model rules or model or standardized or model contracts and terms, whether they should be mandatory for the traders or they should be used only as, say, a point of comparison or a sort of standard with the terms that the traders use. as an instance, as a point of reference for the assessment of whether a term is unfair or not. To say good practices or bad practices on the marketplace could be taken into consideration, and there's model contracts and terms could eventually amount to there's good practices or best practices. So first, and then all the others, but I guess that the first comment is going to be taken by David Martin Ruiz. Simplification and the consequences of it on consumer law.
Yes, I can be brief on this one. Well, first of all, simplification and reduction of administrative burden is a strategic priority at the EU level across all policies, not only consumer law. So this is why it's also, let's say, an overarching priority in the agenda. In practice, it means that we need to consider if there are simplification and burden reduction elements in when we are developing the different initiatives that are mentioned in the agenda. And in terms of what it can mean granularly for consumer law, it would depend on the initiative. It's more a case-by-case basis that has to go diving into that. The principle is that whatever is introduced, whatever changes are introduced, it should not reduce the level of protection. That's something to keep in mind, first of all. But then, just to give you an example of what it can mean in practice, for example, in the context of the Digital Fairness Act, it could mean some changes in the Consumer Rights Directive or the UCPD on certain things. I mentioned specifically this case of repeated in-app purchases. So it could be that the rules related to the information disclosure in those situations are kind of specified or modified, for example. Just one example of what could happen, but again, it's just to be something to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, thank you so much. I failed also to thank you, Francisco de Lizalde from Instituto de Empresa of Madrid, who put this question or comment in the chat box. And then Ilya, maybe you may want to react to the comment or the question that was put to you about this idea of model contracts and terms, whether or not they should be mandatory or just, as we said, standards on the marketplace, or good practices or best practices in order to assess, as an instance, the unfairness of the clauses used by traders.
Yeah, but I think they're like model contract terms, so or model contract clauses. So I don't think you can make those necessarily mandatory, and I think that's not the idea. I think it's what you want to make sure that if you would be a trader and you would be selling certain products or services, and you don't know exactly how, that you have a model that you can use. Obviously, it's a model, so it's maybe you need different ones for different situations because they might obviously not be applicable for every type of product or services. But I guess for a great part, you can probably standardize them indeed. But I would not force companies to use them because, to be very honest, I just said, like, you have 5 million, we represent 5 million businesses. So, and the market is so diverse, there are so many different practices and ways of working that, that will only make life more difficult, I think.
Thank you so much, Ilya. So I see that it's 2 o'clock. We are perfectly on time to conclude and to wrap up this webinar. And finally, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to the speakers, first of all, for keeping up with the agenda quite perfectly and astonishingly, in a sense, because it's not usual that it's always possible to be so, perfectly on time with all the intervention. And of course, I also thank wholeheartedly the audience of this webinar. This is just one of the webinar, of course, of a series of webinars that are organized and put up by the European Law Institute. So, of course, we would be delighted to have you again for the further webinars that are going to be organized. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice
Thank you.
afternoon.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, everyone.